and welcome to the International Day for Disaster Reduction. My name's John Bates, I'm the Research Director at the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre. And just before we get started, I will shortly invite Malcolm Jackman up to do a brief introduction for us for the day. A few safety things. If there is a fire, if there is an alarm, a warden will appear here. The evacuation will be down the stairs, and I'm told it is likely to be in the meeting point out in front of the church. If you need a toilet, they are down the stairs and under the stairs. There's staff and public. Don't all go at once because they're in the males. There is only one toilet. I'm assuming the females is probably the same, so pace yourself, please. Okay, the outline for today, there will be no formal presentations. We'll have an introduction from Malcolm and from Richard Thornton, our CEO, and then we'll have a panel discussion. And I will encourage you to be part of that panel discussion. My instructions to the panel is their answers need to be relatively short, and I will cut them off if they keep rambling on. But the same is true to the audience. I would like you to ask questions of us during the day. I'd like you to engage in the conversation. But if you have a question, please make it a question, and a relatively succinct question, not an essay. We don't have enough time for that, and we want to keep the conversation moving. So this event is being videoed, and so all the speakers will be talking into a microphone, and I will remind them of that as we go along. The Twitter hashtag for today is #IDDR2018, if you want to send a Twitter post out. And for those that have registered for today, we will keep in touch with you through our newsletters and research briefing papers. To kick things off, I'd like to invite Malcolm Jackman from SAFECOM to start us off. Malcolm.
Good morning and welcome everybody. Those who have travelled, welcome to South Australia, welcome to Adelaide, and welcome to this event. Let me start by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Kaurna people, and we recognise that they have a special relationship as the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to elders past and present, and hopefully to future leaders as well. I'm sure you're going to find today quite interesting. Peta and I, as we walked across, acknowledged that we're probably preaching to the converted here in terms of the people that are in the room today, but it is good to have a knowledgeable and passionate audience here. As we said, it's going to be a very informal affair, okay, so nobody's going to stand on too many formalities as we go through. Let me just sort of set the scene a little bit by just talking very, very briefly about the South Australian Disaster Resilience Strategy, which came out of the Burns Review, and it came from Recommendation 33, and Miriam is the project manager of that, and she's been driving that hard, assisted by lots of people that are here today. We've used user-centric design in terms of pulling this together. It's about 500 plus people have had an input into this. SEMC approved the strategy at the meeting in September. We're out for a final round of consultation at the moment, and then it will go to Emergency Management Council and be endorsed by government, hopefully before the end of the year. And I'm pleased to say that we've had funding for Miriam extended, so we have got money put aside to continue the work with this. And yesterday at the State Assessment Panel for the NDRP projects, there's a number of projects that have been put up that fall into the strategy that hopefully will get the tick to go forward as well. The sort of four key themes coming out of this around neighbours and communities, around small business, around children and young people, and around the emergency management sector. And I think for the emergency management sector, the real thing is for us to optimise what we do. What we must focus on is improving the relationships between all the moving parts in the EM sector from there. So hopefully technology is going to be my friend, and I'm going to we're now going to see a short 2-minute animation.
You can lose everything in a disaster. Building resilience to disasters starts in the home and the workplace. Understand your exposure to risk and take action. Reducing economic losses from disasters has the power to transform lives.
I'd just like to introduce Dr. Richard Thornton, the CEO of the Bushfire Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, to give us an introduction to the day and the purpose behind the day. Before he does that, just to remind everybody that we are doing a video recording of this session, and it will be made available in coming days, I suspect, once the comms team have gone and done their magic to it. So, Richard.
And just with the video, it's worth noting that it also gets put up on the UNISDR website as well, so become famous on an international scale stage if you say anything controversial. Firstly, let me welcome you all on behalf of the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC, on behalf of the South Australian Government, and particularly thank SA Water for providing the facilities for today's gathering. The International Day for Disaster Reduction has had a very long history, some 26 years or so, but it's really not been well commemorated in Australia until I guess the last 5 years or so. So we've taken it on board as being an opportunity to really reinforce this day for the past 5 years. We've held commemorations of this day in Canberra, Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, now in Adelaide, and we'll continue to do so on an annual basis. The idea behind, or our idea behind the International Day, is to get people that work in the area to discuss what's happening out in the field, what are the policy changes that are being considered, what new thinking is being brought into the area to make our communities safer. You've just heard some of the thinking from South Australia. There is a lot happening in this area, and there's a lot of moving parts, and that's happening at the international level, it's happening at the national and state levels, and of course in our communities. The United Nations National General Assembly designated the 13th of October, so we're a day early, but we thought it was better to do it on a weekday than on the weekend. October the 13th is as the International Day for Disaster Reduction, to promote a global culture of disaster reduction. This includes disaster prevention, mitigation and preparedness. It is an opportunity to acknowledge the substantial progress that's being made towards the reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods and health. Such outcomes have been enshrined in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction that was adopted in 2015, and of which Australia is a signatory. The Sendai Framework has given us 7 strategic targets, and each of these days over the years will address one of those. In 2016, the Sendai Seven Campaign was launched by the UN, and this year's target that today will be worked around is reducing direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product by 2030. So in keeping with today's focus, or the day's focus, here we're going to broaden that a bit. So it's not just about the economics, it's not just about dollars and cents, it's of course about people's lives, people's well-beings, and recognising the human cost behind the impact of disasters. So this follows a year in which natural hazards have contributed to record economic losses worldwide of an estimated $350 billion US. So it's a significant issue that we're looking at across the world. Part of the discussion we're going to have here today is going to be more about how is the South Australian community adapting and adopting some of the measures to try and reduce those losses in South Australia. There are many lessons here as well for the national picture as well, which will come up through the questions. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for devoting their time to share their knowledge with us. And with that, I will let the speakers who you've actually come to hear, not me, deal with the questions that may arise. Back to John.
Thanks, Richard. Can I just ask the panellists to come up on stage?
particular order.
Yes, you are allowed to have votes, but the questions may go a little bit awry. All right, so what we've asked, just as a little bit of an introduction, we've asked for the panels to go through and just give a short introduction to themselves, rather than me standing up here talking about them, and to make an opening position statement. So I thought maybe Peta, as one of the locals, you might like to kick us off with the microphone.
Sorry. Hello, is that on? Yeah. Hi everybody, my name's Peta O'Donoghue. I'm from the South Australian Country Fire Service. My role is I work with the Information Operations Unit, so both in community engagement and in an operational role in state public information, distributing timely, relevant and credible information. My interest here today is really from a practitioner's perspective. We have a researcher, we have a Fed policy person, we have an engineer and an agency lead, and I'm like your coalface rep here, I suppose. So the actual title of my role perhaps gives an indication of my interest. My role is called Project Manager Partners in Bushfire Safety. So my role is all about trying to get people to share responsibility for bushfire safety. And over time I've discovered that, it's much easier just to talk about emergencies, because it's not just about bushfire. One, preparation for bushfire is, pretty much similar for others when we're talking about emergency planning. But particularly I work with industry and businesses around bushfire safety, and I think I have a few stories to share today, but I'll leave it at that.
All right, thank you. So I might pass over to Alan March just to keep things moving.
Yeah, so Alan March, I'm from Melbourne University, and I have to declare straight away that I'm an urban planner, and that usually invites lots of complaints and stories from everyone. We were chatting about that before. I'm a researcher now, a former practitioner, and probably the big sort of message that I'd like to get there is urban planning counts, it's important. Yes, it's an impediment, but we can do way more in the urban planning space. It's a force that can just be built and built over time. So in direct parallel with that, the built environment. We tend to think about that as a static thing, and we can, and I'll talk more about that maybe later, but we can improve and build on and avoid through this thinking about the built environment. So that sort of double message is what I'd like to...
Just to pick up on one of those things, you might want to come back to it later and talk about whether urban planning is actually an impediment or not. It's certainly seen as an embuggerance by a lot of people, but is it actually an impediment? Don't know, so we might come and explore that. Jill, you're laughing? Maybe you can take it next.
It's nervous laughter. Jillian Edwards from the Department of Home Affairs and on the National Resilience Taskforce. I'm a director on secondment from AFEC into this space with the Commonwealth Government, and I have been asked and was asked to come and have a look at national risk and also national capability. So I feel like I'm sitting here today and we're all standing on each other's shoulders as we embark on the great unknown of trying to navigate our way through all the complexities that were so beautifully articulated in that explanation of the strategy within South Australia as well, the driving forces behind it. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the stories and the experiences that I've gone through as a bit of a hybrid policy person, practitioner and a research translator into trying to actually provide good guidance to the people who are making decisions, and not just our political people, but the people who have responsibilities for trillions of dollars worth of investments for this country. And part of my work has been working on, and obviously as part of the team of the task force, on a national disaster risk reduction framework, which a consultation draft hit the airwaves yesterday. And my contribution to that has been helping to profile Australia's vulnerability and to have a look at a national disaster risk information services capability, so the information needed to help people make complex and challenging decisions.
Okay, so I might round up with Frank Crisci.
Thank you. My name's Frank Crisci. I'm the Manager of Emergency Management for SA Power Networks. I've been in the industry for a long time, and if there's been an industry that has gone through some incredible metamorphoses, it's the electricity industry, and no more now because of what faces us. The challenge, obviously, in this area was brought home when, in September 2016, we had the state going black. That taught us a lot of things in terms of national issues, but local issues. So I guess what I hope to bring today to the forum is the things that have been happening in the industry at a national level, but also the sort of things we've been doing at a local level to help the community with its resilience by us being more resilient and the industry at a national level being more resilient. Hopefully that translates into the community being more resilient.
Right. Thank you. So Malcolm, you've already heard from. So Peter, I might start with you just to sort of get the ball rolling. With your CFS hat on, with your engagement role that you've got, how would you describe the business culture in South Australia generally, and what happens to that culture and how does it express itself when a natural hazard or disaster unfolds in front of it?
That's an interesting question. Pause. I'm actually, I was born and raised in Victoria, so I have, to some degree, I've only been here 17 years, so I'm a new chum. My first, I think, overwhelming perception of the business culture in South Australia is everyone has something to do with wine. Basically, there's a lot of wine. There's wine growing, there's wine industry, there's tourism associated with wine, there's, planning and development associated with wine. So it does, I think I think the culture, it is fairly marginal. I think, if we think of, essentially, we're in Adelaide, and if you look at a map, Adelaide's a bit of a floodplain, and beyond that there's a strip of area which gets some rain and things like that, but essentially we're a very, very dry state. So, and you think of where the goiter line is, and in terms of production above that goiter line, they are running very thin, and also our population as well, at only 1.6 million. So in terms of how they respond after a disaster, what I have seen, like the positives, are the way that the community has banded together and helped each other. So businesses where there's a really strong community culture, I think of some of the fires that we've had, where they've just chipped in and just helped everybody out. So I think that's a really positive thing in the culture. But on the other hand, thinking particularly of the wine industry, there was a nasty example of that broader economic drive where large winemaker refused to take a certain area's grapes because there was a possibility that they might be smoke tainted, but they weren't actually in the smoke taint area. So I think from a culture's perspective, there's a lack of shared responsibility for emergencies, and that means investment and ownership of risk.
Okay, so that's probably a good spot to jump to Malcolm and say, you look like you've been in South Australia a little longer. Do you... or not?
I like drinking what...
So do you... I guess, first question is, do you agree with that? And then to sort of try and tease it apart and say, are there layers within that culture? We start right from the biggest of industry right down to the smallest of micro and family industries. How does that look?
So look, when you look at the South Australian economy, and of course, remember we're a commonwealth of states, and we're particularly different to everybody else, as each economy is different to everybody else. So we have a couple of things, as Peter said. We have the highest capital city concentration of population in the country, and we also have, on the reverse to that, we actually have the highest concentration of small communities in the country as well. So most of us live here in the Greater Metro, but everybody else is spread around all these very small communities. We also are basically a small business economy. Okay? So yes, we have some very powerful organisations, industrial organisations, whether it's BHP, up at Olympic Dam, whether you now start to talk about what's happening down at Techport in terms of naval shipbuilding, etc. But in reality, we are a state of small businesses. And what we do see is when we do have disaster events in our communities, okay, we see small business impacted very very significantly. We see a significant number of small businesses that close for the event and never reopen. Okay? And then people say, oh, that's a bit of a shame for that business. But that business generally employed people who were in the community, and they generally provided services to the community. And one of the things that we have done as part of this disaster resilience strategy is really engage with business, particularly through SA Business, to try and actually get a big shift in that, okay? Because almost no businesses, the small businesses, have BCPs, in terms of business continuity plans. We're going to look to get templates out there, because small businesses just don't think about those sort of things. It just won't happen to me. So they might be selling large amounts of food and things like that, but they have no backup power, okay, etc. And Frank can talk about the backup power, okay, because the fire might not get anywhere near the community, but the power is out because something else has happened, etc. So there's a real need to have business engaged in this process, and I think to date we haven't done that particularly well.
Yeah, that's probably a good spot to jump over to Frank. I guess the power industries generally come in for a bad rap when things happen, because one of the first things that disappears is power. Everyone says, where is it? You had the luxury, if you like, of going through the Black Power event in 2016. But I think for me as an observer, what was the issue with that substantially from a resilience perspective was not that the power went out, it was everything else that happened when the power went out that people hadn't realised was going to fail and disappear. I think the NBN and the new networks and the private connections that would drop out and people would have no communications was one of the things that popped out of that. So what did you learn from 2016 as a network? And if we were to have another Black Power event somewhere in this country again and lose substantial parts of the state, would it be different? And why would it be different?
I've always maintained that we did the state a favour by turning it off, because it confirmed how resilient we were. Putting that aside, it was a watershed event. Clearly, the ingredients that went into the loss of power was something that maybe had not been contemplated, and I think as a result of that, a lot of soul searching went in at the national level in terms of the way the electricity grid is managed, and a number of steps have been taken to make the grid a lot more robust and thereby avoid a similar event. The catalyst for that event was something quite incredible. To lose 3/4 of our transmission network up north is a scenario that we don't expect to happen in South Australia, and the likelihood of it is pretty small. Nevertheless, should it happen, we're in a better position, because the network, when that sort of event occurs, is configured a lot different to what happened on the day. So, in answer to your question, we learnt a lot at a national level, certainly at a local level, in terms of keeping customers informed, restoration priorities. But at the national level, we configure the network differently now for possibilities of weather being as extreme as they were on that day.
I'm just going to grab this because I'm going to actually go out to the audience in a minute. Now, Michael Armand, who was Red Cross, who's suddenly jumped up because he's realised I'm going to ask him a question, he's now with local government SA. The Red Cross was really intimately involved in the recovery events and the relief events after that. Are you or someone else from the Red Cross, can you give us a view of what you saw in industry and what was happening to economic activity in the more outreach areas of South Australia when that happened?
Sure, and I can see some of my Red Cross colleagues over the table, over the aisles. I might defer to them as well. I think one of the things that was really apparent from certainly on the West Coast, where the power was out for some time, and I will defer to my colleague Julia over there because she was actually on the ground during that time. All the sort of the cascading impacts that I think have already been sort of noted. You know, there were all the stories that came out whereby the power outage. Yes, we know that that's going to impact people, we know it's going to impact businesses, but it's then the sort of flow-on effects for people who might be living with pre-existing risk factors. So, for example, you might think it's easy to dismiss, oh, you're losing a fridge full of food, but for certainly members of the community who are living with some pretty complex risk factors, whether by virtue of sort of illness or income or whatever, for whom losing a fridge full of food is actually really will actually set them back for months at a time. There are a whole lot of other sort of, certainly from a business perspective, some of the anecdotal stuff we also heard was around people, the classic stories of, yes, there was one petrol station in town that had a generator, but of course you could only get that generator if you can only access that fuel if you happen to have cash in your wallet, and those sort of cascading things. Of course, one of the things that then cascaded on was also then around the communications. I think particularly in the early days, I think over in Port Lincoln, I heard stories of, well, actually, if you wanted to get a mobile signal, you actually had to be able to get up onto a hill, because you actually could get a mobile signal. Of course, to get up the hill, you need to have petrol. To get petrol, you need to have cash, and so, flow on. So there's a whole lot of complexity around that. And just one last story as well was actually just around the access to backup generators as well. And if I can segue to my current role, where I'm now working with local government, we're doing this really extensive engagement process at the moment with local government around emergency management. And one of the things I think has been most interesting around that was just around the assumptions of what would actually be available. Because again, so we saw in those September 2016 events, assumptions that you could access generators, you could access contractors and so on. And certainly in our current work with local government, what we're finding is there's this incredible optimism. There's incredible optimism around if the proverbial hits the fan, we're going to be, there's a business in town that sells generators, we'll get it, we can access those resources. Unfortunately, as many of us in this room know, often those resources are already pre-tied up. So I think there's a whole lot of, there's a lot of, and I think speaks to some of the previous comments from the panels, we have all these real assumptions about what we might be able to access in those sort of situations, which might not always be the reality or the case.
So we might come back to it later if people want to. So Michael, thank you for that. And we're going to jump over to Jillian in a moment when we get the microphone back out the front. With the work you've been doing with Home Affairs, you've been looking at vulnerability profiles. The last couple of stories have talked a lot about vulnerabilities that are out there. How is your work going to try and deal with some of those things? Because on the ground, at the grassroots level, they are the things that are going to have an impact on economic performance and quality of life.
Those stories were brilliant illustrations of the growing dependency and interconnectedness of how we actually live our lives, how society functions, and fundamentally how the consequences and implications of the decisions that we are making now for our prosperous future. So the work I've been doing, and I've been reflecting, it's going to be hard to keep this to 2 minutes, John, I have to say. I've been reflecting on, it's almost 12 months ago that the team from the EMA at the time and the Resilience Taskforce now met here in South Australia, and many of the people in the room were actually at this workshop where we started to have a look at one of the least understood aspects of the risk triangle: vulnerability. So we've got a pretty good understanding of some of the hazards now through the great work of the CRC and other pieces of research, universities, contributions, incredible knowledge base. We have some understanding of the exposures now and the consequences of the interaction of those exposures with those hazards, but we have not so much understanding of the systemic vulnerabilities that contribute to disasters. The hazards themselves don't. It's when they interact with us as a society, with our infrastructure, our assets, and the things that we depend on. And that sort of prosperous future that we have all want to see and are desperate to continue has been built off the backs of some wonderful decisions that have been made for this country. And those decisions have been made with the best intentions. However, with the circumstances that are changing and the great unknown into which we are heading, I think we need to do something different. And we need to understand and be thoughtful about the future decisions that we make. And all of us in this room have a role to play. And there are limits that we can all take a reach when we are making decisions for ourselves, for our families, for our businesses, for our infrastructure, for our governments, and for the economy, and for our social cohesion as a wonderful nation that we enjoy right now.
So picking up on the systemic vulnerabilities is probably a good spot to jump to, Alan March. So it's often said that without people and buildings inhabiting our environment, we don't have a problem. There will be no disasters. But that's not a reality that we live in. We do live in and around the environment. And I think we've evolved over a long period of time. So my question, Alan, to you to start off with is, what are the principles of urban planning and governance that have got us to the environment we live in today? And if you had your magic wand, what are the 2 or 3 principles that you might want to think we should change, and how long might it take before we see a benefit?
I'll try not to give a lecture like I'm back at Melbourne Uni, but I think that's a great question. Urban planning can be practiced in many different ways. We have a particular way of doing things here in Australia which is very reactive. We are moving into new modes of urban planning right now, and certainly some of the things that the Taskforce are looking at include that. But we've tended to have a very development control approach, as in someone wants to do something on a piece of land and we'll tell them whether or not they're allowed to have a permit. That is important and will continue to be a big part of the power of urban planning, but what it means is that it doesn't allow a lot of scope to imagine what the future might look like and the different scenarios and the implications of the huge investments that we have in places, in settlements. So it doesn't really allow us to add up, to take an account of what the future scenario might look like. So urban planning has this potential, and it is used to some extent in Australia, that it has this potential to take stock of the different risk profiles of what a different type of future for a settlement might actually look like. So are we high density, are we low density, are we taking account of the different vulnerabilities of people, so where do we put the childcare centre, or indeed the golf course or the houses and things like that. So if I did have the magic wand, we would develop a much more integrated evidence base. We'd measure off the different kinds of risks associated with different potential futures, and we would strategically join together the different decisions of other parties and try and avoid the worst of those risks. The challenge we have, as a final point, is that, and we made a joke before about urban planning being an impediment, if we ratchet up the controls too much, then we are an impediment. We still have to let business do its thing, we have to let people, make their own life choices, etc. So we need to find that little sweet spot, but there's heaps more we can do in that strategic planning, evidence-based decision approach.
Okay, I think Jill wants to say something quickly.
Yes.
I just think that's a wonderful segue to this example that I'd like to share of the importance of the information that informs big decisions about where we put our people, our assets and our communities. I remember, and I have this vivid image of this gentleman's face when he came up to me after I spoke recently at a floodplain management conference. And he actually is a councillor of a local government, and his face was full of concern, absolute concern, and I could read it in his eyes. In fact, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it now. And he said to me, Jill, I have, this council has $1 billion worth of shovel-ready projects, and I know that there are some issues that we have to deal with in making those decisions. Where do I go for the information I need to help me make that decision? And of course, he's a councillor, so the executive of his council are clearly working their way through all those decisions and need to be able to inform him and provide good guidance to the decision makers about development, land use planning, ability to be able to support their community, the economic prosperity of that particular coastal municipality. But it just illustrates the challenge that we all have, and I bet everyone sitting in this room has crossed your mind as well about what sort of decisions that you are confronted with now, for which you are making decisions about prosperous now versus a prosperous future. And this man was, terrified at the prospects and really looking for great guidance and comfort and confidence in those decisions.
And that's a good reminder that in the middle of all of this, there are people. And people have to make decisions with evidence, and there are some real challenges with that. So before I go on, are there any questions so far? Anyone that would like to throw? Yes. We just get a microphone to you.
My question's probably aimed most at Alan, because it concerns urban planning. I was involved in the Canberra bushfires a number of years ago, and a lot of the issues there related to the way that the beautifully designed city almost aggravated the fire paths. Have we learnt very much from that?
That's a great question. Thank you in advance, because I think we really have learnt a lot, but at the same time, once we build a city or invest in a road or a pipeline, you name it, there's a high level of permanence in these things, and that's why we really need to be careful what we do. We've learnt about ember attack, which was a big learning from the 2003 Canberra fires. We've learnt about garden design. We've learnt about utilities, gas meters in the front of houses that, fail and things like that. We've learnt about defendability of spaces. We've learnt about density and urban morphology, the shape of places, the value of perimeter roads, and we've learnt about good regulation. On the other side, we've learnt about community messaging and bringing a community along and helping them to help themselves and indeed their neighbours. So we have now I think a really progressive joining together of science and practice and research and indeed the challenging bit, the regulatory components of that as well. But as I say, we have to deal with existing settlements as well as new settlements. So it will take time to deal with all this.
So that's a good bit for some audience participation. I mean, Alan's talked about planning. He's talked about existing settlements. This is sort of, Alan's going to take this back to his class, maybe, depending on what the results look like. To the audience, if we were to introduce some planning changes, things that would reduce our exposure to bushfire, reduce our exposure to flood today, how long do you think it would be before we started to be able to measure the benefits of that change? And I'll start with 20 years. Think up, everyone should have their hands up at 20 years, because if we can't do it in 20 years, we fail. Not 20, more than 20. I mean, and I think, I think for me, and I'll go to Malcolm at a state level, that is one of the challenges, that there are some things we can do short term, and maybe then Jillian after that. There are some things that we can do in the short term that are incremental. Some of the big stuff potentially has long lead times. The risk with long lead times is they're outside of a political cycle. So who makes that decision, and how and why do they make that decision? And Malcolm, you look like the right guy to take that up.
So let me start the story by saying that I got my first driver's licence, full driver's licence, when I was 15 years old.
Your first? Do you mean you've had several?
Oh, because I did lose it for a little while. But back then, there was no seatbelt belts, okay? You smoked in the car, okay? You put your hand out the window regardless of what the health risk to sunburn might be, okay? You didn't worry about drink driving because the breathalyzer hadn't been invented. The only way a cop could get a blood reading was to take you to a police station and have to get a doctor in to take a blood sample, etc. That was a world where, we didn't have smoke detectors, we didn't have pool fences, etc., etc., etc. But the world in 50 years has changed quite dramatically with all of that. But it takes time, it requires intergenerational change for those things to come through. So my children, my grandchildren will never think about getting into a car without the seatbelt or whatever. They don't think about smoking, they don't think about drink driving, etc., etc., etc. So the world has changed, and we will change with it. But then if you look at the footprint of the emergency services in South Australia, 525 points of presence, they are a reflection of history. They're not a reflection of where we are now, okay? And we're starting to look at that in some depth, but we know, okay, that will be, okay, a 20 to 30 year journey to shift that footprint to make it happen. Because we build buildings to level 4, so we expect them to last for 50 years. We buy heavy appliances, okay, to last a minimum of 20 years, etc. So even our economic investment cycle is geared around things happening inside 20 years. So when you said it's got to happen inside 20 years, my belief is it won't. Okay, and I don't think it is, okay, about political cycles. I think these are things, and this is where the resilience strategy, where I think we need to go, is driven by this intergenerational change. My view about a lot of this is we need to get our grandchildren to think about what their great-grandparents looked like and how they were resilient versus what their parents or their grandparents looked like. So it's almost a back to the future. We need to think that the resilience community of 2030 will look something like the resilient community of 1910.
Okay, well, I'd like to comment a bit on the discussion there about, well, there's a few things I want to touch on, like that it's the responsibility of the kids. Well, I'd say whose responsibility is? Like, I want everyone to put their hand up, you know? Everyone put your hand up, come on, put your hand up. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's not something, because I often get this, you know, when I go and talk to a business or something, they come looking to the emergency services, give us the answer. And I'm like, oh yeah, bad luck. I'm not here to give you the answers, I'm here to ask questions. Because I actually don't know your business. I don't know the community you work in. You know, I don't know the local guys that you associate with down at the police station. You know, so it's really not my responsibility, but I'm helping them, you know, to prepare. So I just wanted to, you know, challenge that it's about the kids. I think that it requires, we hear it all the time, you know, you know, it's council needs to do something, you know, planning needs to do something. No, I need to do something. So I'll just put that out. And the other thing I wanted on that is I can't get past the vulnerabilities thing when we've been talking so long about a strengths-based approach and now suddenly we're back to vulnerabilities, because I think that's a very negative approach. I think that we need to look at who we are today, what strengths we have. I mean, one of the things about we can't change the way that our settlements are because of historical. So, you know, there aren't going to be any instant changes. And I once again, we'll see this with industry, that they want to, you know, do a risk management approach and, you know, if we put this in place and put this in place, then we'll think about that. No, I don't want you to think about the physical stuff now. That's a big investment. I want you to think about your people, because life comes first, for, you know, and that, you know, ultimately I think that's what it's about. You know, we're aiming for a happy society, and it's about people rather than things or places.
That's a beautiful segue to a response from me. I absolutely agree, strengths-based approach is the thing to do. And in Australia we are coming off a foundation, and that should be leveraged and built upon. And so picking up on, and mind you, we've been on the receiving end of similar comments about that approach, about, you know, having a look at vulnerability, and we've done a lot of research on this space as well. And there is also a view that actually confronting your vulnerability actually allows you to address your risks, because without understanding where those vulnerabilities are, it's pretty tricky to know where to start. So, and in the context of, I think the gentleman at the back was talking about the underlying shocks and stresses across society. That's a really important factor in understanding where the vulnerabilities exist across the systems that support people and livelihoods and life and property, you know, injury and everything to do with people, because disasters don't occur until they actually impact people. So they could be, obviously, have an effect on the environment, but certainly the consequences of both economic and social costs happen to us as people. So the focus of really being able to support a cohesive and joined-up approach to addressing disaster risk is really being able to understand the systemic vulnerability. So less about individual, you know, sort of circumstances, which are absolutely important to understand, but where do you start with this complex space? Let's have a look at the system. The system actually creates the vulnerability in the first place. It creates the disaster risk. It's the decisions that are made, the choices that we all make that contribute to that. So being able to unpack that and understand it better allows us to actually be more resilient.
Okay, so I might just pass over to Alan and I'll just throw a few comments.
Yeah, look, I think the research we're doing in the integrating urban planning with emergency management and risk mitigation has shown exactly that. that we have some large processes of decision making with, I guess, based in legislation. And it becomes almost a political science question of who decides about what and when, and for whom, and communities that often don't have a voice until later. This is not an easy thing to fix, but it would yield incredible benefit if we could just work out the sequencing a little bit better. We have systems that were based around, and I am being a town planner again, property rights and letting people do their own thing on land, and incremental understandings being developed about individual sites on the whole. And we need to flip that right on its head and think about the big picture and reduce exposure in the first place before we even start thinking about vulnerability or capability, and build that evidence base, as I said before. So I really agree with the decisions about people first being a big driver.
Yeah, so just before Malcolm, one of the challenges we've got with all of these is when we look at vulnerability and other things, we're taking a snapshot at a moment of time. So it just says today or last year, whenever the measure was taken, that's what it's like. And I suppose it's a bit of an unashamed plug. One of the projects that the CRC has been running is looking at the Australian National Disaster Resilience Index, which is a way of measuring change over time, because we can't just invest in things. If you look at the budget in South Australia, you look at what the Commonwealth has to spend, there is nowhere near enough on the table to do all the things that we need to do. So how do we choose the things that we want to invest in, that we should invest in, that will have, we think, the best investment of time? And I often relate some of this to the sorts of things we have with an influenza pandemic. We know it's coming, but can anyone in this room tell me whereabouts in South Australia that will land, or if indeed it will land in South Australia? The answer is no, you can't do that. Natural hazards, we can do that a little bit sometimes, but we still don't know where they're going to come, so we could end up with a huge investment that doesn't actually change anything for a long period of time and leave exposure out there. So there's a whole lot of challenges in there, and Malcolm, you wanted to say something.
I just think one of the most interesting observations around all of this is all those river-based communities around Australia. We keep building perpetual memorials to our stupidity, and they are these big poles, and on them we put brass plaques, and we say, this was the flood of 1923, and this was the flood of 1935, and we continue to rebuild, okay, even though we know inevitably that we're going to have a flood of at least that consequence, if not worse, in the future. And in Lismore, New South Wales would be an absolute classic example of that. And maybe we should stop building those memorials to our own stupidity.
So again, out to the audience, anyone who has a question? Okay, so we've got a couple.
Oh, hi. I'm Pip Rockers. I'm from Adelaide, Jillian. My background's in health, public health. And when you mentioned pandemics, and we're talking about vulnerabilities, I just wanted to note that we don't actually have anybody from health represented here, which I think would be nice in future, because any of this discussion about vulnerability, resilience, and it's central to the Sendai Framework, is that we have health engaged in everything. I mean, health nurses, our framework, our resilient hospitals, it's embedded in everything. And if you don't have resilient, strong people, we need the nurses, we need the doctors engaged in this space. So it's more a comment to have these people involved. And vulnerability is one thing and strength is another, but we need to make sure that everybody is on the same page with this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. And we had another question down the front.
On the urban planning issue, I just wanted to make a comment about where the risk lies. So when you're talking about developers, they actually hold the risk for a really short period of time, as do councils, and then and potentially the financiers of those. So the risk is actually, for that decision, is passed along very quickly to the individual, and then ultimately with the expectation that emergency services will be at their aid despite the poor planning decisions that are made by developers. So there needs to be penalties built into it for poor decisions.
Yeah, look, I absolutely agree. This has been an ongoing problem in urban planning kind of forever in this country. Excuse me. And actually at the policy sprint for the National Resilience Taskforce, we, in the planning corner, there were kind of two main planners and other associated people. We actually drew a diagram of that, where risk lies over time. And it really, it's the first time we really thought it through, trying to sort of measure it. And it's quite remarkable about how we kind of let things slide, and I think it's another part of this incremental change assumption that we have, and it'll be okay. So it's all about building the evidence base in advance and making the right decision, and thinking about just how much it will cost into the future, and putting a number on it as well, I would say.
So follow up to that as well is the evidence base. In the work that we're doing in the task force and have done about the vulnerability profile, we've actually leveraged the work of the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC on who owns the risk. So if you haven't actually delved deeply into that piece of work, and it was Roger Jones and Celeste Young are the names that spring to mind immediately, who worked on that piece of work. And it's fascinating when you really stop and think about the risk transference that you talked about, and part of the silence that goes with that transference. And we know that through the hearing from people at the workshops that we have run around the country, and including the policy sprint, that it's what we don't say that also contributes to some of our risks. And so being able to actually have some hard conversations would be a good thing to do, and to really start to unpack the implications of that risk transference. And of course governments are the insurers of last resort at the end of the day, so the taxpayer ends up paying for all of these sort of impacts that we have. I had thought of an example, but it's left my head.
Okay, so just to sort of move along, and I'm going to come to you in a minute, Frank. Did you want to say something first?
I was just going to kind of give a bit of an example of the contrast between how in the emergency services world we respond to an emergency versus what we're talking about here, which is planning in a planned world. In other words, when there's an emergency, it's amazing the cooperation that happens, and things just happen, and you can't help but be wondering why the same thing doesn't happen. People out there in the community say they've just dug up the road to put the water pipes, then we put bitumen over, and then we come along and put the electricity and telecommunications network. So it does seem like a bit of an irony that we can't do it. But in the electricity industry, I couldn't help but notice a few media releases today which kind of paints the complexity of the picture when, if I may read a couple of segments here, AEMO Audrey Zieberman, AEMO, she's the head of AEMO, says electricity supplies would continue uninterrupted if the coal industry shut down within 30 years, contradicting the Morrison government's warning of devastating blackouts. And then you've got opposition leader Bill Shorten has backed coal exports and power station, softening Labor's stance, but said he wanted to see more rooftop solar and batteries in people's homes. The complexity here, and I take the electricity industry as an example, is getting us all on the same page. We are a diverse society. We all have a different view about how things should be solved. And the emergency brings our thinking together. So unless there's a feeling is that there's an imperative to change and that we should all be thinking the same way, I think we'll all have diverse views, and it's going to be a challenge to bring all those diverse views together. But the challenge is there.
Interesting comment. Last year, the Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience released their latest report, and I was at a session up in Brisbane, and the chair of one of the big banks was talking about what that bank did in terms of helping communities who were affected. They brought in telemachines, they put in more people, they stayed open later, but all sounded really good. And I asked him the question, and what do you do once everybody's gone home and the disaster has passed? And the answer was just like this room was then. There was nothing in there. So what we find is that when there's an emergency, everybody comes, everybody plays together in a sandpit, everybody is a friend, and then it's over, and they go back, and it's business as usual, profit, minimise costs, all those sorts of things. And I'll come to Alan in a minute. So it sort of takes it on to people, you know, decisions that people make, and everyone in this room, me included, are making decisions either as an individual, as an emergency responder, as an NGO employee or leader. Every one of us is making decisions, and those decisions will have an impact on economic outcome. They'll have an income on survivability. They'll have an income on quality of life. Everything that we do. And so this whole bit of people in there is a really important part, and that is going to change constantly. We can have rules and regs and all those sorts of things, but people have to interpret them and do things with them, and they have to do things with them in times of high stress. Alan first, maybe? Okay.
I'm going to go first.
Okay. She's got the microphone.
I just wanted to build upon what Frank was just touching on as well. And I think this is the sort of complexity and uncertainty that we're navigating our way through, that the emergency management sector needs to be, you know, their role and responsibilities in this space are critical, and they deal with residual risk. And there's been a lot of criticism of the Commonwealth Government not spending enough on mitigation, and you could actually translate that same comment to pretty much everyone. But essentially, the responsibilities for mitigating risk step way outside the emergency management sector. So we're introducing the other sectors to this complex world that we've been occupying and inhabiting for decades, centuries, and overlaid with a bunch of other complexities that are now, you know, sort of weighing heavily on everyone, being able to actually explain this complexity to people who have not necessarily been in that space before. So that's part of our communications challenge, and introducing the shared responsibility concept to another level. And in doing so, I think we all need to recognise that everyone has their limits. We as individuals, businesses, communities, governments, every sector has its limits. And at some point, as you cascade through those limits, we all have to sort of put our shoulders to the wheel to help out. So when you reach your limits, what do? You have to reach for help. So that sort of cascades up, and at some point, and you just got to look at what's happening in America right now with Michael, boy oh boy are they reaching their limits. And it's a little insight into what we know are intensifying and growing natural hazard impacts for this country. And the interval periods between when they happen are getting narrower and narrower, and that has consequences on so many levels.
I might change my comment a little bit to sort of work off the back of that. That we still, I think, are privileging certain natural hazards and indeed risks. Heat wave is, I think, a great example of where we should work together with a huge diversity of people. Of course, we are doing that a little bit across Australia, but you know, I guess this brings in health. Thinking of the comment before, but where some of the silent problems really do need to be dealt with, and we now have a pretty good evidence base of just how significant heat wave is, but we need to join those dots. So I think there are some large areas of work that are yet to really be dealt with, and probably the other area, a bit of a hobby horse of mine at the moment, is recovery. We could be doing so much more in the recovery space now before the event, and I think particularly about urban planning in that respect, where we don't get to have a go at recovery, but in fact we know some areas will have another flood or have another fire or so forth, and we could be doing all the really hard work and the evidence-based decisions now, and then avoiding knee-jerk reactions. We can have much more considered things to do in that space. So there are some big openings for huge improvements we could make.
So I'm just going to hijack the conversation back to the people end of the equation, because I do believe all the comments we have are all extremely valid, but the reality of life is we have to deal with where we are today. Okay? And as Peter said, it's a collective responsibility for all of us. And I think one of the great challenges that we've got is that in 2018 we have created the nanny state when it comes to disaster resilience in any shape or form. So everybody expects somebody like Michael to turn up at their front door when there is an incident of one shape, form or another, and that somebody will save themselves from that. So, and I don't think that we, as government, okay, really actually tell the story, okay, that should be done. Now I'm getting into your area here, Frank, but we do have a fire danger rating system, okay, and we're looking to upgrade that, etc. What we don't have is a power outage rating system, yet I know from the work that goes on behind the scenes, Power Networks has modelling that tells them based upon what weather patterns are coming, how many crews they need available, etc. to go from there. When the system black occurred, okay, and the briefing is the SEC, Power Networks stood up and said, we would expect with a storm of this nature there will be at least 250 power outages in the state over a 12-hour period. We don't communicate that to our population. Okay, so our population doesn't know what they would think. I always told a smart aleck comment that I said to my wife as I walked out the door that morning. I said, there could be a power outage tonight, let's barbecue, okay, and that, etc. But people need to start thinking about that. You take Michael's example, okay, and we do this all the time. Hands up, everybody in the room, okay, that has got more than $100 cash in their pocket right now. And given the price of fuel is now north of $1.60 a litre, I just filled the car this morning. It cost me more than $100 to fill the car this morning. So we're not making people prepared, and we're not actually asking people to take account of or to take accountability for themselves. Okay, and the planning reforms that we're talking about, okay, will take a very, very long time to go. The Metro Fire guys here are well aware at the Building Code Australia, there's a lot of talk about trying to get rid of this 25 metre sprinkler rule, so that we actually have to have sprinkler systems in buildings underneath 25 metres high. Even if that was to be legislated and be part of the Building Code as of Monday morning, okay, it'll be another 50 years before every building under 25 metres, multi-storey building, has sprinklers in it. So these things take a massive amount of time to change, and I think this is why the resilience strategy and the people piece, okay, and this public information piece is so vital, okay, to how we're actually going to prepare for the disasters that inevitably come.
Mm-hmm. So, Frank, then I'll...
I just couldn't help but respond to some of those comments about the electricity. That was no. But I think the point you make very valid now. Particularly, we've kind of been shy about telling people the truth, you know, because it might hurt them, or it might make us look sick that we're not doing our job. But reality says that when you get certain events, they are way beyond the resource ability that you have. So what you have to do is be able to escalate your resource level or do something a bit smarter. So we certainly learned, 2016, the year was just a year from hell in terms of the impact on the electricity industry. And were we not to have done things differently, then we would be negligent at best. So picking up on your point about the number of outages, we're in fact collaborating with the University of Adelaide to do just that, model weather and look at the potential consequences on our network, so that we can make sure we have the appropriate resource level, and the collaborators here today, not that was engineered. But the point about it is that we feel a responsibility to do that now. The nanny state idea, it's an interesting one. I guess we're doing it because that's our responsibility, but we hope that by doing that we're helping build resilience rather than, you know, putting in nanny state.
Please don't. You know, like, people can look out the window, for goodness sake. You know, they don't need a text to tell them, ooh, there's a big storm coming. You know, the power might go out. I think we're just enabling behaviour by creating more demand for information. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but I'm just, I suppose, questioning the investment in providing more notifications to people rather than perhaps investing that in empowering them to make safe decisions in the absence of information, which is, you know, one of the, certainly CFS has commissioned research after incidents, and you know, we found that, you know, that's one of the major things, that it doesn't matter how prepared people are, you know, when the shit hits the fan, excuse the language, but it's real, then it's actually how emotionally prepared we are for the event that is actually going to influence what sort of decisions we make under pressure.
So that's a really good segue to the question I was going to ask out to the audience. You know, we've talked about decision making, we've talked about people, and I guess we've got a lot of organisations represented in the room. Now, as you get to that point where the proverbial shit does start to hit the fan, where stress goes up, where emotion is starting to come in for a whole range of things, how are you and your organisations making decisions on what you want to do? And the question about health was a good one. There are a lot of things that are implicated or complicated by what you do or what you don't do. How are those decisions, and I don't want Malcolm to talk yet because he'll give us a state view, but I'm actually interested at an organisational level. Red Cross, what do you do? Local government, what do you do, and how do you decide where to allocate your resources? Is it based on what you need as a local government? Is it based on what your community need as people? Is it based on what your local Chamber of Commerce needs for its business to keep going? Anyone want to throw that out there?
Well, can I just give an example to illustrate it while they're thinking? You know, a country hospital, of course it's bushfire because, you know, I'm a bushfire person, impacted by bushfire, thought they had everything in place to shelter in place, but we didn't have a common operating picture amongst all our, you know, responding services and the site, and also the staff didn't really understand what that would mean to be sheltering in a town that is essentially in a burnover. You know, you're going to survive, but it ain't going to be pleasant. But, you know, one of the things that, you know, we try and teach people is that, or get people to accept that, you know, it's safer to be in a township than it is on the road in a fire. So it was just that realisation then when they did their lessons learned, which I really encourage everyone to do after an incident, for learning and sharing of, you know, lessons, that, you know, the emotional response of their staff meant that the situation wasn't what they expected and the outcomes weren't what they expected. So I'd take it to the audience there.
So is there someone who'd like to get up and talk about what your experience is in your organisation? We've got Michael. Thank you, Michael.
I'll just...
No, you have to questions there.
Just a couple of quick thoughts from local government, because we've been doing this really intensive engagement process. The short answer from a local, because we've actually framed that very question to councils, and we've had, you know, 20 or 30 people, council staff in the room. The answer is it varies, and, you know, a couple of examples come to mind. The one example that comes to mind is Murray Bridge, Thomas Food Fires. For those of you who don't know, massive factory fire, big abattoir, 1,300 employees in a small regional city. When that event happened, we heard that pretty much the mayor and the CEO were on the phone to each other within, you know, while the fire was just started, saying, we're going to step up, we're going to provide leadership. And, you know, we're not sure what that looks like. And then as the recovery process has transpired, that council has done incredible things in terms of how it's connected with a whole range of agencies, with the unions, the food, the whole supply chain, a whole lot of stuff. A really good example. As in terms of those decisions, though, where my mind went when you mentioned it was actually around, what about the decisions in the mitigation space? And, you know, because I keep looking at the question on the board, and again, it varies so much, because one of the things that's come through our work with councils is that councils are really significant contributors to mitigation. They just don't call it that. And for me, it's one of the great learnings from our work today is that, you know, just yesterday, we were at a large metropolitan council along a big river. They've been doing all this work, all this advocacy, and they've done all this advocacy, done all this effort to try to leverage funds to invest in really critical infrastructure that they know is going to really significantly reduce future disruptions. is emergencies part of that conversation? Largely not. And I think that's been a really fascinating learning for us, and I think that's part of what we're working through with councils is around, well, how can we actually start to bring in emergency management into that conversation, into those critical decisions? Same with planning. You know, and I can say this as I'm a planner. I'm a planner by background. I don't often feel safe to say that in emergency management circles. Alan's already taken all the hit. But I mean, you know, again, so we're finding with, you know, so I think there's a tremendous opportunity though to actually start to bring in that language of disruption, that language of emergencies into those critical decisions that are being made. Because certainly what we're hearing from a council level is that I think emergencies, or thinking about that risk, it's not high on the agenda in terms of what's motivating that decision. And again, just one quick anecdote again, because when we talk about, often we've been asking our council staff members, what are your elected members talking about when you're making that decisions? And you know, and again, we heard the really good examples. Also heard the examples that our elected members aren't interested in pipes. They're not interested in stuff underground. They want a playground to cut a ribbon on. And again, so they've talked a lot about the need for some of the cultural change to support the decision makers at that level to recognise, well, actually, those pits under the ground, it's about the future rather than the shiny playground tomorrow.
Yep. So if no one has any questions, I will actually pick a couple of people I know in the audience, so it could get dangerous. So maybe pull up on research perspective. You look at black swan events. What's your sense of how decisions are being made when people get to those events that are just unexpected? They have the oh my god moment. What happens next? What do they think about?
Well, I think the interesting thing that really falls out of the conversation today about cascading consequences and complexity in systems that some of the panellists have talked about is that occasionally the outcomes are unexpected. And so there are a couple of questions about how you deal with that. I do think there's a great deal of work required to be done around the development of organisational management and culture in ways that, as with many things in resilience, improve the situation for businesses and other organisations every day, not just in emergencies, but absolutely in emergencies that are unexpected. And those sorts of changes are often things to do with noticing smaller signals, taking responsibility for other people's work, being vigilant about things other than the thing that you're employed to do, all sorts of things that you might do in that space. And then the other piece for me is, and it relates to infrastructure and arrangements, is that many of the unexpected events that we see corporations and organisations faced with are the result of sensible decisions gone wrong in another context. The greatest example out of the Black System event for me was the incredible reliance on fuel cards for corporations. And so we found organisations that once might have had their own fuel supply running out of fuel, and that included some quite critical community services. Not because they were busier, and in fact in some instances it was quieter during that period because it was particularly stormy, but nonetheless not being able to provide the service that's needed in the community. So I think the unexpected consequences are worth thinking about, and there are ways in which we can do more plausible futures work that helps to identify that. We see some parts of our country more focused on that kind of work. Principally defence is perhaps the best example of a plausible futures focused planning strategy, but we can do that across communities as well. So just a few comments along those lines.
Thank you. So is there someone from Red Cross that would like to talk about, from the NGO perspective, how we go about this decision making and what happens?
Sure. I think there's a real push and pull in decision making from an NGO perspective on the influence you're getting from community and community leaders and locals on the ground. And I think most NGOs would love to say that's the primary factor in all our decision making and responding to events. But it's naive to not also understand the pull from the political side of things, state government, and the complexities around economics and how you decide where do you resource your response, and how does it play in with the whole state government response. And I think there's also a push and pull in decision making from the organisational perspective and the on-the-ground response. And I think a great example of that was the Black System event when communications did go down and we saw these very localised responses. So in Port Augusta, when the power was out, the key focus was getting a generator into the office, getting information out to locals on the ground that might be struggling, getting warm water out to people that might need it. Whereas in Port Lincoln, where there was relief centres with thousands of people coming into it a day, it was how do we, without a phone system, get enough volunteers, enough personnel, how do we engage with all the other community service agencies out there and get them to come in and help resource that centre, and then how do we deal with compliance to have a more spontaneous community-led type response. So I think there's many factors that influence the decision making and impact how quickly and how much you have to change backwards and forwards as more information comes in and as the push and pull sort of shifts around which direction particularly NGO organisations go during and after.
Thank you. The panel, would any of you like to respond to any of that? Jill.
I was just reflecting on the use of the word community. I'm a member of the community. I'm a member of multiple communities. And I think somewhere in our sort of our narrative that we have to unfurl over the coming periods is to engage with all of those different sort of communities. And I'm just reflecting on, one of the drivers behind or incorporated in the disaster risk reduction framework is to reduce the costs, economic costs and social costs of the disasters that we are regularly feeling as individual community members, as part of our roles within the Commonwealth Government for me, within the University of Melbourne and the planning cohort. As leaders in state government, as leaders in the Red Cross, we are all part of multiple communities, and this is part of our challenge of being able to actually tap into and talk with on a range of levels with people. Without us as people, we're not going to get anywhere. So I'm sort of reflecting on that economic and social prosperity issue and the sort of community of people that represent our banking and finance sector and have responsibilities for trillions of dollars worth of our superannuation funds, the pricing of insurance risk, the management of our mortgages that support our homes, when we purchase our homes, that support business and economic prosperity, and how do we engage with them on these issues of mitigating disaster risk and their contribution to supporting the investments in our critical infrastructure, in our communities, in our assets. And so I just thought I'd share that with you, that that's actually a reflection that needs to have further considerations. That the use of the word community sort of conjures up for me often that it is about that, us sitting in our homes somewhere, as opposed to, which is incredibly valid, don't get me wrong, but it is also about other groups of communities that are just as important.
And when we think about insurance, just before Malcolm talks, the interesting thing to contemplate is if we find, as we often do, that the tourist meccas for Australia are substantially in areas that are slammed by cyclones and storms, that our food bowls are in those places and they're flooded often. How do we share that insurance risk? Because when we're talking about economic growth, when we're talking about community development and business, if all of those businesses are being slammed, insurance premiums goes up or they go out of business, the rest of us are going to be paying a lot of money one way or the other. So there's a whole lot of complex challenges around how we actually look for things if we want to enjoy going to Queensland, going to places like that, enjoying bananas, strawberries and other sorts of foods that are at risk from the sorts of weather that we have. It's sort of a rethinking of, well, it's their problem, it's not mine, I just eat them. Well, actually, if you eat them, you might find that your strawberry, rather than being about 10 cents a strawberry, might be $20 a strawberry. How many of you would eat strawberries at $20 and blueberries at $50 each for one? Nobody. That's a challenge because your health will go down. You'll all get really sick. So there's a whole range of things that are buried in amongst all of this, and Malcolm has some words for us.
Well, the poor old strawberry is getting a bit of a hammering these days. Just as an aside, before I get serious again, there's a body in the state called the Emergency Services Leadership Group, which has the three chiefs, the Commissioner, the head of SAS, myself and the head of DPC, and we meet periodically. The Commissioner always provides lunch, and as part of the lunch he generally serves a little bit of sandwiches and there's some fruit. And here we were with one of these wooden skewers with fruit on the wooden skewer, and at the top of the skewer was a strawberry. The Commissioner, with his dry sense of humour, says, "I think this is evidence of a crime scene." I just wanted to comment a little on the community and on the decision-making thing, and I actually think in emergencies one of the great challenges for us as we go forward, okay, is how people make decisions in emergencies, because I actually think that the community, and I see it in my career looking at C-suite executives, for example, their ability to make on-the-move decisions has actually become a lot poorer than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And that is because we've all become so reliant on being able to get so much information. For want of a better word, you can Google almost everything and people will tell you how to make the decision. When you pull the plug on the power, okay, and you pull the plug on all those information systems, okay, then you end up with people having to make decisions with very limited knowledge, with poor situational awareness, okay, and they're trying to make decisions which they've never been trained to do. So you actually see in these times of emergency people that have worn a uniform in one shape, form or another, whether they're in the military, whether they're first responders, or whether they've worked in the ER or whatever, okay, these are the people that are really good decision makers at this time. But when you get down to local government and you get to the community as a whole, we don't have a large number of those people. So getting people to make sensible decisions, okay, without the information that they could get off their phone or whatever, is a challenge for us in times of emergency.
And just to pick up on that, when the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience was launched, they ran a couple of masterclasses with Adelaide. And one of the things that sticks in my mind from that was that when the events of 2010-11 happened, the statement was the rule book ran out. We didn't know what to do, but we had to do something. And I guess that's the position that we're all facing, that we do have a rule book, we have a playbook, we have experience. What are you going to do when none of those are relevant to what you're doing? Or you try something from that playbook and it really is failing badly? What are you going to do? Because you can't do nothing. Because to get up in front of a Royal Commissioner or a Premier or the media and say, "Oh, I didn't know what to do, so I just did nothing." Can I? Greg, would you do that? When the rule book runs out, would you get in front of the media and say, "Well, I don't know what to do"?
I would work something in.
Absolutely. And that's where people come in. You need to be able to work. You need to be able to work something out. And the question is, how are we bringing up our next generation? How are we educating our current generation of people to be able to make those decisions when they don't have all the information, when things are flying in at an incredible speed, and you've got to do something. And everybody's looking at you for a decision. They want your leadership.
Can I make sure that we extend this to the impact phase? Because too often when we talk about emergencies, everyone's always focused on the incident. On the incident. But what we should be doing is preparing to recover. And, you know, we need to make difficult decisions at that time, and decisions that in hindsight may not have been the best are sometimes made, and maybe they could have been made better. So, I'd look, maybe anyone in the panel got a feeling for then how can we push the discussion about resilience away from, reducing the impact of one incident to the more in the resilience long-term.
So that's probably, we're getting towards the end, so that's probably a good chance for starting with Alan, just to sort of try and wrap it up and give your views. And that's a fabulous topic to do it on.
Well, Holger Mayer's in the audience, and in association with one of my projects, Decision Support System Modelling and Scenario Testing. And, this is an ongoing feast because systems change and data comes, but good evidence-based and scenario testing, and then the ability to do something about it is is part of this puzzle, and we can put numbers on it, we can put lives on it, you know, etc. And the real challenge is to act on these things and to have legislative bases when appropriate. I think also we need to look to some of our new and emergent risks that will come, such as living at high density. And I noticed, Malcolm, one of the little logos or symbols was about higher densities and crowds gathering, and you know, that's going to be another whole bunch of scenarios that we haven't thought about that we need to think on as well. So I'll finish with that one. Thank you.
I'd like to think that in a few years' time, and I won't put a particular number on it, that Australia is well prepared for and agile enough to adapt to the intensifying and frequent natural hazard impacts that we will be experiencing. And I'll extend that just a little bit further, that it in fact doesn't matter where the shock comes from. That we are able to pick up the preparedness for the impact, be prepared to and adapt to the complexity, and that the interconnected and highly interdependent essential services that underpin how we all live our lives and how Australia's prosperity continues to be sustained and enhanced is well connected and understanding of each other's impacts on the decisions that are made. I've got some here. The cost of disasters are actually reduced, and that the measures and the mechanisms that underpin all of this are actually more cohesive and joined up and making a difference. I'll let you put the time frame on whether or not that can happen.
I apologise up front if this sounds like Emergency Management 101, but I think the whole resilience issue comes about from experience gained through having gone through emergencies. And the phases which, again, prevent, prepare, respond, recover, and the fifth one occasionally is resilience. But certainly in our little world, we review our performance after every major event. The purpose of that being about continuous improvement. And I know after the State Black event here, there were a number of reviews done, as we know, the Burns review. So I think in terms of building resilience, the most sound way of doing it is to see what went well, what didn't go well, and try and build some resilience the next time. And I think as was stated before, maybe by Paul, some events occur that are out of the box. We just don't know. But the more you practice, like we do exercises for that very reason, that we throw a whole bunch of scenarios. A couple that I came up with, people said in my group said, "Oh, that'll never happen," and sure enough, they did. So it's that kind of thing. There's an analogy I use, and that's to make chefs rather than cooks. Cooks follow recipes, chefs have to make up the recipe. So I think training, learning from the past, building resilience through improving the way you do things is what we ultimately need to do.
Thank you.
So what was the question? Where we want to be?
It's just a wrap up. You can pretty much say whatever you like.
Awesome. Give me the mic now. No, I just want to. So I'll just say. How many? Oh, well, it's a question. I always ask a question. Who's here from the private sector? Yeah, not a great deal. Emergency services or emergency management. Yeah, so there's a bit of a community services, non-government. Yep. I think what I'd like to see is us listening and being, I don't know, in the same room and having coming back to that common operating picture of our risk and sharing both the responsibility for living in the environment that we do with the hazards that are there, and just, it is what it is. Let's do it properly. Share and listen and shared action. That's me.
And I suppose I finish on the same theme. It's about the people. This is, forget community, it's everybody. And it's a shared responsibility, and we need to get on with it. I listened to a presentation at the AFAC conference from one of the guys out of Christchurch. I think he had been an employee, was now a councillor and all the rest of it. But he quoted a Maori proverb about wanting to know the answer, and if you want to know the answer, it's ask the people, ask the people, ask the people.
Thank you. So just before I thank the panel, I think it's, one of the things that's important for all of us is that if we have no imagination, we're not going to be prepared. The criticism often of exercises that are done is that we exercise to succeed. What we need to do is to imagine what's possible and then dream a bit beyond that. And if we can deal with those, we're going to be reasonably well prepared. But balanced with that, we have to have people who are given the ability to express courage in the decision making and the actions that they take, and to be supported by those around them, because the decisions that we make don't always work. How many of you have children? How many times did you make a decision that you thought was perfect, that really just bombed out so badly? It happens, and life is not all about making perfect decisions. Emergencies, disasters, perhaps somewhat behave like children, completely unlike what you expect most of the time. So, a couple of words for that. So, look, I would like to thank the panel, Alan, Jillian, Frank, Peta, and Mel. We wrap up. I would like to invite Richard Thornton up, who's going to give us, I think, his thoughts on the session this morning. Richard.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo John's thanks to the panel. I think it was a great discussion. My take out is we've got it all linked, right? We've got all the answers, we know where we're going. Clearly that's not the case, and that we really need to be talking. And I think if there was one particular outcome out of these discussions, is that we need to continue to talk. The aim of these sorts of events is to bring people together to have those conversations, which is why we decided we weren't going to do death by PowerPoints this time and actually have a conversation. Hopefully that you felt that worked. I think there's a few learnings that will come out of some of the commentary today. Firstly, that this is not necessarily about the things and the infrastructure and all the other thing. It's actually the people that are important here, and that we need to engage with the people, whether they're in the communities that we live in, the communities that we work in, or the broader general community as a whole. So I think that came out fairly strongly. I think the debate around whether we should be taking a strengths-based approach in the community and understanding resilience, or whether we start from the perspective of vulnerability and where do we need to change, I think will be one that continues for many years, and I think it's a healthy conversation to have as well. I think the interconnectedness of our systems and where we get information from on the day is really important. And I think we underestimate the degree of that connectedness sometimes. I don't think we think big enough. We often talk about Australia being a lucky country. I think from a hazard perspective, we actually have been relatively lucky. Black Saturday could have been so much worse. We haven't really had a major cyclone strike on a big city in Australia since Darwin. We really haven't seen a 1 in 100-year bushfire, or in a lot of cases floods or other things. So I think we have missed and dodged the budget quite a few times, but it's coming. And we all just need to be ready for the inevitability of those big disasters that are happening. And I think the other challenge for the sector is we all talk about learning lessons, and the people who learn the lessons, the people in command, the people in control of these events, if they ever are in control of an event, inevitably go through a Royal Commission, and if past history is anything to go by, they usually end up without a job at the end of it. So there's no lesson learned in that process. There's nobody carrying forwards the learnings of what went right and what went wrong, which is a cultural shift that we need to make as a society, I think. So that's my take. I would just say a couple of words about the CRC, because I've got the mic. It's important from our perspective that the use of our research is as wide as possible. So I'd encourage you all, now that you're here, with some material around the place, there's a bunch of our research stuff around the place. Please, after this, have a chat with them, work out how you can use our work, have a look at what we're doing, because some of the issues that were being discussed here are covered quite extensively by some of the work that we're doing and will intend to do into the future. With that, I'll hand back to John.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. And second last thing, I'd just like to invite Jim Maguire from SA Water to come up and say a few words. And we really do appreciate SA Water hosting us today. It's been a wonderful thing. Thank you very much.
I won't be long because the food's waiting and I don't want to keep you between now and the food. Just so it was a great privilege to be able to host the event today. The insight has been profound, I think, and it's great to hear the differing views as well. It's good to have debate, and it's why it's such a complex area that we're working in. For us, it's really timely as well. We talk about essential services, water obviously, and wastewater services, fundamental to quality of life. And for us right now, we're building our 10-year plan and a strong focus on business resilience and continuity. But also we play a key role in working with our state colleagues in responding to events and helping with recovery. So really wonderful to host you all here today, and please make sure you don't rush off. I know that we're always so busy. It's important to take the time to reach out to each other and enjoy each other's company as well. Thanks once again.
Thanks, Jim. So just before we finish up, I would like again to thank the speakers for giving their time freely today. It really is appreciated. And following on from Jim's comments, they are around for a while, so if you want to catch them up and talk to them, it's a really good opportunity to do that, because we don't often get this bunch of people together in the same place at the same time. I'd also like to thank our supporters, the Department of Home Affairs, the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, SAFECOM and SA Water. And probably I should say that the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience is today with us launched the Australian Journal of Emergency Management monograph number 3 on diversity and inclusion. It's the proceedings from a conference that was held last year, so that's available online for people that are interested in that, looking at where diversity and inclusion goes. Because one of the things, as a theme, that didn't really come out today was diversity and inclusion. We certainly need to be inclusive to make things happen, because otherwise we'll leave a whole lot behind. So thank you all for coming and participating in the event today. We do have some information that's out there, and I should put in a plug for this Australasian Natural Hazards Management Conference, which is happening in June in Canberra next year. It will be an extension of these sorts of conversations that the CRC is facilitating to try and get us to think more and to engage more, to look at how we can feed new research, things that are happening, observations, reviews into what's happening, so that we can really start to prompt national discussion and debate around things, because there is no perfect answer. There is no solution that you can get together and say, here it is. But it's collectively us saying, I need to do this, or I hadn't thought of that, how does this fit together, could we do that? All of that conversation is what we have to do, because without that, and without getting the right audience to have that, we will continue to struggle to achieve the sorts of outcomes that everybody on the panel spoke about today. So on behalf of the CRC, thank you all for coming. There is, I believe, some really scrumptious food outside, and we'd love you to stay and join with us to have that. Thank you again, and thank you to our panel.